Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we tackle really big topics, dive into a whole stack of sources, and pull out those surprising facts, those crucial insights that, well, really help you get properly informed.
That's the goal.
And today, we are plunging into something truly immense, incredibly complex, World War II. Now, for a lot of people, the story of the war, it's often dominated, understandably, by the big players, the major powers, the famous battles.
Right, the ones everyone learns about.
Exactly. But what we found, digging through our sources, is a much, much richer picture, a really intricate tapestry of events, contributions, and some really surprising threads woven in.
Things like the specific impact of new tech, almost science fiction stuff back then, like radar, jet propulsion. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. And the critical, often just completely overlooked, role of sheer industrial power. And maybe most surprisingly, the pivotal part played by nations you might not immediately think of, like Brazil.
Yeah, that's right. So our mission today is to really unpack this rich stack of historical material. We want to uncover not just what happened, but try and get to the deeper why behind the war's most critical moments, and also shed light on some of those, fascinating, often forgotten stories.
We're aiming to give you a genuinely comprehensive understanding, help you get well-informed pretty quickly, but without feeling completely swamped by the sheer volume of information out there on World War II.
It can be overwhelming for sure.
So what's the journey for today? Well, we'll kick things off by setting the ideological stage, really understanding the core beliefs driving the Axis powers. Then, we'll dive straight into the huge shifts in military strategy, the incredible technological innovations that just fundamentally changed warfare.
Yeah, things that still shape conflict today.
Exactly. From there, we'll have to confront the immense human cost, the reality of total war. We'll look at critical decisions made by key leaders, the good and the bad.
And then, importantly, we'll bring a spotlight onto Brazil's unique role. It was pivotal, fascinating, and often, as you said, understated.
Right. And by the end, we'll hopefully connect all these different threads, all these dots, to really see how World War II profoundly reshaped, well, everything. The whole world we live in now, its legacy is still right here with us.
It absolutely is.
Okay, so to really get a grip on World War II, we have to start before the first shots were fired, really. We need to understand the ideological stakes, because the ambitions of the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, they weren't just about grabbing land.
No, not at all. They were about fundamentally reshaping the entire global order, and often it was through a lens that was, well, frankly, dystopian, a terrifying vision for humanity.
And what's striking when you look at the sources is how their core motivations were distinct, yet dangerously similar in some ways.
Very much so. Take Nazi Germany. Their driving force was this concept of Lebensraum, living space, primarily looking eastward into Eastern Europe. But this wasn't just about territory. It was explicitly linked to a truly horrific, deliberate goal, the systematic annihilation of Europe's Jewish population.
And not just Jews, also Roma, Slavs, political opponents, anyone deemed undesirable by their twisted ideology.
Precisely. Then you have Mussolini in Fascist Italy. His dream was essentially to resurrect the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire. He wanted to expand Italian influence across the Mediterranean, into North Africa, restore that imperial glory. A very different historical justification, but expansionist.
At Imperial Japan, their militaristic leadership had this idea of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Which sounds quite benign on the surface, doesn't it? Co-prosperity. But in reality, it was a very deceptive euphemism. It meant Japanese dominance over Asia.
Securing resources, right. Oil, rubber, tin.
Exactly. Resources vital for their growing industries and, critically, their military machine. So different justifications, different regions, but all fundamentally about aggressive expansion and imposing their will.
In these regimes, despite national differences, they shared some really chilling common features, the things that define totalitarianism.
Absolutely. Total control. That's the essence. They sought absolute control over every single aspect of life, not just politics and the economy, but social structures, cultural expression, even the private lives of citizens. Nothing was off limits.
How did they achieve that kind of control?
Through a relentless combination of tools. Pervasive propaganda, flooding every newspaper, radio wave, cinema screen, widespread surveillance, creating an atmosphere of fear where neighbors might inform on neighbors, systematic terror, using secret police forces, arbitrary arrests, concentration camps.
And mass mobilization, right, getting the entire population behind state goals, whether they liked it or not.
Precisely. And another key feature was the intense cult of the leader. Figures like Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, they were presented as almost godlike, infallible, charismatic saviors who embodied the nation's destiny.
It's such a stark contrast to the ideals of liberal democracy, which emphasize individual rights, different viewpoints being allowed, checks and balances on power.
Exactly. Liberal democracy is built on preventing that kind of total concentration of power. Pluralism versus the monolithic state.
So it was against this backdrop, this truly terrifying vision, that the Allied powers, mainly the US, the Soviet Union, the British Empire, faced this huge existential task.
Daunting is an understatement. They had to prevent this dystopian vision from actually becoming the global reality. The stakes couldn't have been higher. It was about the survival of independent nations, sure, but also about which ideology would prevail, liberal democracy or totalitarianism.
And arguably the moral fabric of humanity itself.
You could say that. The outcome of this war, it wasn't just about winning battles. It fundamentally shaped the world that came after. Institutions like the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the whole Cold War dynamic,
Yeah.
it all has roots right here.
Okay, so with these incredibly ambitious, terrifying ideologies driving them, how did the Axis powers actually start putting this into practice on the battlefield? Let's talk about Blitzkrieg, Lightning War.
Right. Blitzkrieg unleashed. This wasn't just a new tactic, it was a fundamental shift in how war was waged. It was basically a combination of things focusing on unprecedented speed, overwhelming surprise, and, crucially, the seamless integration of air power and ground forces working together.
It wasn't entirely new out of nowhere, though. There were theories.
No, it evolved from concepts developed in the interwar years, notably championed by figures like Heinz Guderian in Germany. But the Germans were the ones who really refined it and put it into terrifyingly effective practice. It just stunned the world initially.
And the early results were, well, staggering.
They really were. Look at Poland, September 1939. It fell in weeks, not months, weeks. It showcased Blitzkrieg's brutal efficiency and also the ruthlessness of the Nazi ideology behind it. No hesitation.
And this followed the period known as the Phony War, right? Where Britain and France declared war but didn't immediately launch major attacks.
Exactly. That brief, uneasy, quiet period starkly exposed how unprepared the Western democracies were. They were still thinking in terms of World War I, perhaps. Static defenses, gradual mobilization. Blitzkrieg just bypassed all of that.
Poland was just the start, though.
Oh, yes. A prelude. The rapid conquest of Denmark and Norway, then the lightning invasion of the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and then, crucially, France. In May 1940, it solidified Blitzkrieg's fearsome reputation.
And the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was key here.
Absolutely pivotal, especially the dive bombers like the iconic Ju-87 Stuka. You hear accounts of the psychological impact, the sirens. They coordinated devastatingly with the ground troops, hitting strong points, disrupting communications, allowing the Wehrmacht, the German army, to advance at this incredible pace. They just outflanked traditional defenses.
And that led to Dunkirk.
Yes. The sheer speed of the German advance trapped the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and parts of the French army on the coast at Dunkirk. Their only hope was this desperate evacuation across the English Channel.
The miracle of Dunkirk.
A miracle in the sense that they rescued over 338,000 soldiers who would live to fight another day. But they had to leave almost all their heavy equipment behind: tanks, artillery, vehicles. It was a symbol of defeat, even as it saved the army. And soon after, France was forced to surrender, the map of Europe just redrawn in months.
But Britain didn't surrender. That stand seems crucial.
Incredibly crucial. Our sources really emphasized Churchill's defiant stand. He faced immense pressure, the very real threat of invasion, but he absolutely refused to negotiate with Hitler.
His belief was that time was on their side.
Yes. He believed Britain could hold out, that eventually the tide would turn, perhaps with American help. This refusal forced Germany to focus resources on trying to subdue Britain, particularly through the Air War, the Battle of Britain, and this significantly delayed their next big move.
Which was Operation Barbarossa.
Exactly. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Churchill's defiance bought precious time, delaying Barbarossa, and that delay became incredibly important.
So the war goes truly global. June 22nd, 1941. Germany invades the USSR.
Operation Barbarossa, a massive undertaking. And it was a catastrophic misjudgment by Stalin. He'd received warnings from his own spies, even from the British. But he seemed to trust the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that non-aggression treaty he'd signed with Hitler in '39. He thought it would hold, at least for longer.
The initial Soviet losses were horrific.
Absolutely catastrophic. Millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the opening weeks and months. Vast territories overrun. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles.
But this immediate existential threat created a strange alliance.
An incredibly unlikely partnership, the Soviet Union and Great Britain, driven purely by the need to survive against a common, overwhelming enemy. It laid the groundwork for the bigger Grand Alliance that would later include the U.S.
And then, just a few months later, the other side of the world erupts. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Our sources call it a masterstroke of military planning and execution in terms of its immediate impact. Utterly devastating.
The numbers are staggering. 8 battleships sunk or heavily damaged.
Over 300 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and tragically, more than 2,400 Americans killed. The image of the USS Arizona sinking, it's burned into memory.
And then a few days later, Hitler makes another move.
Yes, what our sources describe as his catastrophic miscalculation, declaring war on the United States. Why he did it is still debated, maybe overconfidence, maybe trying to support Japan, maybe thinking war was inevitable anyway.
But the effect was immediate.
Completely unifying. Before Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration, America was deeply divided about getting involved in the war. Isolationist sentiment was strong, but these events ended that debate overnight. The American public was united against both Japan and Germany, and that brought the full, untapped industrial might of the U.S., the arsenal of democracy, into the global fight.
So the war is now truly global, incredibly complex, but even early on, there were signs the Axis tide could be turned. Turning points.
Absolutely. Things weren't all going the Axis way. In North Africa, the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. This was the first major Allied land victory against the Axis forces.
Montgomery versus Rommel.
Exactly. The British Eighth Army under Montgomery decisively defeated Rommel's renowned Africa Corps. Churchill famously said, and our sources quote this, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat." A bit hyperbolic, maybe, but it captured the mood.
Huge for morale.
Immense. And it also demonstrated the growing Allied proficiency in combined arms warfare coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power effectively. Lessons learned the hard way, but vital for future campaigns.
And at roughly the same time, maybe even more significantly, Stalingrad.
Stalingrad, yes. This became the turning point on the crucial Eastern Front. The battle raged from August 1942 to February 1943. Just brutal house-to-house, street-by-street fighting, unimaginable suffering and casualties on both sides.
And the Soviets managed to encircle the Germans.
Yes, with Operation Uranus, launched in November 42, they trapped the entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 Axis troops, inside the city. Hitler fanatically ordered them to hold out, forbade any breakout attempt.
But they couldn't be resupplied adequately.
Not nearly enough. Conditions became horrific. Starvation, freezing cold, disease. Finally, General Paulus, the commander, defied Hitler and surrendered on February 2nd, 1943.
This was more than just a defeat, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. It was the first major, undeniable defeat of the German army in the entire war. It shattered the myth of German invincibility that had persisted since 1939. And it marked a fundamental, irreversible shift in momentum on the Eastern Front that was consuming the vast majority of Germany's men and material.
Yeah.
From Stalingrad onwards, the Soviets were largely on the offensive.
It's clear that World War II wasn't just fought with soldiers and old tactics. Innovation played a massive role. The conflict itself became this crucible for incredible technological leaps.
Absolutely. And not just technology, but also unprecedented industrial mobilization. It was a battle for supremacy fought in factories and research labs just as much as on the front lines.
Let's start with the air war. It really changed from theory to devastating reality.
It really did. In the years between the wars, you had theorists, Giulio Douhet in Italy, Hugh Trenchard in Britain, Billy Mitchell in the U.S., who were pushing this idea of strategic bombing.
The idea being you could win wars from the air.
Essentially, yes. They argued you could cripple an enemy's ability to make war destroy their factories, their oil supplies, and crucially, break the morale of their civilian population, all without getting bogged down in the horrific trench warfare of World War I. It was a very appealing idea at the time.
And they got a chance to test some of these ideas.
Well, the Spanish Civil War served as a brutal testing ground. The bombing of Guernica in 1937 became infamous, tragically showing air power's potential against civilians. But the first major, purely air campaign was the Battle of Britain in 1940.
Britain versus the Luftwaffe.
Right, the RAF against the German Air Force. And the RAF's victory, which stopped Hitler's planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion, really highlighted the importance of one specific technology.
AR.
Radar gave the British crucial early warning of incoming German bomber formations. The Luftwaffe heavily outnumbered the RAF, but radar allowed the British to scramble their fighters efficiently, concentrate them where needed, and avoid wasting fuel and pilots on fruitless patrols. It was a force multiplier.
But the Luftwaffe, despite its early successes, had weaknesses.
It did. Our sources point to fundamental flaws. It was primarily designed for tactical support of the Army, not for long-range strategic bombing. It lacked heavy four-engine bombers like the Allies later developed, and eventually it really struggled against the Allied bombing campaigns due to shortages of fuel, trained pilots, replacement aircraft. They couldn't sustain the losses.
So the Allies then took the offensive in the air, from 1943 onwards.
Yes, the combined bomber offensive. Initially, it was incredibly costly. Allied bombers, especially the American B-17s flying daylight raids, suffered very heavy losses to German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. It was touch and go for a while.
What changed?
Innovation again. The big one was the introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the American P-51 Mustang. This plane was a true game changer.
Because it could fly all the way with the bombers.
Exactly. With external drop tanks, it had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and back. It could take on the German fighters, protect the bombers, and dramatically reduce those crippling losses. That, plus improvements in radar for navigation and bombing, better communication, it all tilted the balance.
And the impact on Germany.
Profound. The sustained bombing campaign inflicted serious damage on Germany's industrial base. They targeted oil production, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, things essential for the war machine. They also hammered transportation networks, making it harder for Germany to move troops and supplies. It didn't win the war on its own, but it severely hampered the German effort.
And in the Pacific, the Americans have the B-29.
The B-29 Superfortress. A technological marvel for its time. Huge range, massive payload, pressurized cabin, allowing high-altitude flight above most anti-aircraft fire and fighters initially. This plane enabled the U.S. to launch strategic strikes directly against the Japanese home islands from bases captured in the Marianas.
Which led to the firebombing strategy.
Yes, a grim development. General Curtis LeMay shifted tactics from high-altitude precision bombing, which was often inaccurate, to low-altitude incendiary bombing at night. Operation Meeting House over Tokyo in March 1945 was the terrifying result.
The first firestorm.
Hundreds of B-29s, stripped of guns to carry more bombs, dropped massive amounts of incendiaries. It created a literal firestorm that devastated 16 square miles of densely packed, mostly wooden buildings. An estimated 100,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed in a single night. It marked a horrifying turning point in total war, effectively erasing the line between combatants and civilians.
Now, Germany had its own advanced weapons programs, the Wonder Weapons.
They did. Some were truly revolutionary, showing incredible engineering prowess, but ultimately, they came too late or in too few numbers to change the war's outcome.
Like the Me-262 jet fighter.
The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe Swallow? The world's first operational jet fighter. It was a paradigm shift. Swept wings, powerful jet engines. It was significantly faster than any Allied propeller plane. Allied pilots encountering it were stunned.
But it didn't have the impact it could have.
Several factors limited it. Hitler bizarrely insisted on prioritizing its development as a bomber, the Blitz bomber, which delayed its deployment as a fighter where it was most needed. There were also major problems producing its advanced jet engines reliably, and Allied bombing disrupted production. So, while individually formidable, too few saw combat to make a strategic difference.
And the V-weapons. V-1 and V-2.
The V-1 flying bomb, essentially an early cruise missile. The Germans called it Vergeltungswaffe of Vengeance Weapon 1. It was launched against London and southern England primarily. Its pulse jet engine made this unnerving buzzing sound, hence the nickname Doodlebug. It would cut out just before impact, adding to the terror.
Indiscriminate, though.
Completely. A weapon of terror. Over 9,000 launched, killed around 6,000 people. Then came the V-2. This was even more advanced, the world's first ballistic missile.
Meaning it couldn't be intercepted.
Right. It traveled at supersonic speeds, launched vertically, arced high into the atmosphere, and came down faster than sound. No warning. Just a massive explosion. Utterly terrifying. Again, launched mainly against London and Antwerp after the Allies captured it.
But strategically decisive.
Not really. Like the Me-262, they were technologically impressive, pointing towards future warfare, but production was difficult, expensive, constantly hampered by Allied bombing, and they simply weren't accurate enough or numerous enough to change the strategic situation. They were more psychological weapons, instruments of terror than anything else.
Let's shift to the sea. The naval war saw just as dramatic changes, didn't it? The rise of the aircraft carrier.
Absolutely fundamental. World War II definitively marked the end of the battleship's reign as the queen of the seas. The aircraft carrier became the dominant capital ship.
Like the American carriers. Essex class, Independence class.
Exactly. Those classes, built in large numbers, along with the smaller escort carriers like the Casablanca class, gave the U.S. Navy incredible reach and flexibility. It wasn't just about the ships. It was a whole new doctrine centered on naval air power, projecting power hundreds of miles from the fleet itself.
How did the Japanese Navy compare initially?
The Imperial Japanese Navy, the IJN, started the war with arguably the best carrier planes and most experienced naval aviators in the world. Their carrier doctrine was highly advanced, as seen at Pearl Harbor. However, they had fewer carriers overall than the U.S. would eventually build, and crucially, they lacked the industrial capacity to quickly replace losses, both ships and critically trained pilots.
And they still put a lot of faith in battleships.
They did. They built the Yamato class, the largest, most powerful battleships ever constructed, immense ships, huge guns. But as the war proved time and again, these surface behemoths were incredibly vulnerable to determined air attacks launched from carriers, a fatal miscalculation in the age of air power.
And the turning point was Midway.
The Battle of Midway, June 1942. Our sources call it the end of an era for Japanese naval dominance. It was a catastrophe in 4 acts for the IJN.
How did it unfold?
American intelligence had broken Japanese codes, so they knew the attack was coming. U.S. Navy dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment when their planes were refueling and rearming on deck after striking Midway Island. In just a few chaotic minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were hit and turned into blazing infernos. A 4th was sunk later.
4 fleet carriers lost in one battle.
And crucially, almost all their experienced, irreplaceable air crews went down with them. It was a blow from which the IJN's carrier air groups never fully recovered. Midway fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. The U.S. went on the offensive, and Japan was on the defensive for the rest of the war.
Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, a very different kind of naval battle was raging.
The Battle of the Atlantic. A long, grim, grueling contest of attrition, as our sources put it. This was primarily the fight against German U-boats, their submarines.
Using Wolfpack tactics.
Yes, brutal tactic. Groups of U-boats would coordinate their attacks, often striking convoys of merchant ships at night. They sank millions of tons of Allied shipping carrying vital supplies, food, fuel, weapons, troops from North America to Britain and the Soviet Union. For a time, they pose a genuine existential threat to Britain's survival.
But the Allies eventually got the upper hand.
How? It was a combination of things, a real triumph of Allied naval strategy. Technology played a huge part. Better radar to detect surfaced U-boats, improved sonar, a stick for underwater detection, more effective depth charges.
And intelligence.
Absolutely critical. The breaking of the German Enigma naval codes by the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park was maybe the single most important factor. It provided invaluable insights into U-boat positions, planned operations, and patrol routes.
So they could reroute convoys.
Exactly. Steer convoys away from known U-boat concentrations. Or conversely, send hunter-killer groups, destroyers, and escort carriers directly to intercept the U-boats. It was a massive intelligence coup.
Other factors, too.
Yes. The development of long-range patrol aircraft, like the American Consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat and the British Liberator bombers, fitted with radar. These planes could patrol far out into the Atlantic, hunting U-boats from the air and closing the mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats had previously operated relatively safely beyond the reach of land-based aircraft.
And the convoy system itself.
Perfecting the convoy system was vital. Organizing merchant ships into large groups protected by naval escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates. It made it harder for individual U-boats to find targets and easier for the escorts to counterattack. All these elements combined technology, intelligence, aircraft, tactics, eventually broke the back of the U-boat threat by mid-1943, ensuring the vital Atlantic lifeline remained open.
It really underscores how multifaceted this war was. It wasn't just battles, it was code-breaking, production, logistics.
Absolutely. And that brings us squarely to the industrial engine of war, because ultimately, victory often came down to who could produce more and sustain it longer.
And here, the United States played an outsized role, the arsenal of democracy.
A truly fitting description. Our sources talk about a quantitative revolution in U.S. production. It's hard to overstate the scale. By 1944, the U.S. was producing more war material than all Axis powers combined.
The numbers are just mind-boggling. 300,000 aircraft.
300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks. The example often cited is Ford's Willow Run plant, built specifically for bomber production. At its peak, it was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber roughly every single hour, just one factory.
Incredible. And Lend-Lease was part of this.
Lend-Lease was a game changer. This act allowed the U.S. to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies with vast amounts of military equipment, food, and raw materials, essentially on credit or as a loan. It kept Britain fighting in 1940 and 41 and provided critical support, especially trucks, fuel, and food to the Soviets. It enabled allies to sustain their fight until America's own military could fully engage.
What about the Soviet Union's industrial effort? They faced invasion.
It's an equally astonishing story. Despite losing huge industrial areas early in the invasion, the Soviets performed an industrial miracle. They literally dismantled hundreds of factories, machines, workers, everything, loaded them onto trains, and relocated them thousands of miles east to the safety of the Ural Mountains.
And rebuilt them there.
And rebuilt them, often in incredibly harsh conditions, and started producing again at astonishing rates. They produced around 100,000 tanks during the war.
Including the T-34.
The legendary T-34. Our sources call it a revolutionary design. Not necessarily the most sophisticated, but rugged, simple to manufacture and maintain, with sloped armor and a powerful gun. It was perfect for mass production in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. They also produced about 150,000 aircraft. This incredible industrial effort was absolutely key to their ability to absorb massive losses and launch huge counteroffensives.
How did German industry compare? They had a reputation for quality engineering.
They did, but that sometimes worked against them. Germany often pursued a quality over quantity approach. Think of their later tanks, the Panther and the Tiger. Individually formidable, powerful weapons.
But complex.
Incredibly complex, high cost to produce, mechanically unreliable, requiring enormous amounts of maintenance and specialized spare parts. Our sources talk about gigantism and over-engineering. Resources were sometimes diverted to overly complex projects.
Like using the 88mm gun.
The 88mm flak gun is a good example. An excellent anti-aircraft gun, it also proved devastatingly effective as an anti-tank weapon. But because they often lacked enough dedicated anti-tank guns early on, these valuable flak guns were frequently diverted to ground support roles, arguably weakening air defenses where they were desperately needed later. Ultimately, Germany just couldn't match the sheer production volume of the Allies, especially the US and USSR combined. Their complex designs meant fewer units reached the front, and keeping them running was a constant struggle.
Which highlights the importance of logistics.
Absolutely. Logistics, the science of moving and supplying armies, was often the Achilles heel, as our sources say. It frequently determined the success or failure of campaigns, especially large-scale armored warfare.
Like the German advance in Russia.
Yeah. A prime example. They advanced so rapidly in 1941, they outran their supply lines. Tanks ran out of fuel and ammunition, spare parts couldn't keep up. The vast distances and poor infrastructure in Russia made sustained offensive operations incredibly difficult for them. Allied logistics, particularly American, were generally far superior, capable of moving vast quantities of supplies across oceans and continents.
Let's touch on artillery, too, another area of innovation.
Definitely. The Soviets achieved real mastery of massed artillery. They believed in overwhelming firepower. They would concentrate thousands of guns, heavy howitzers like the 152mm ML-20, and of course the famous Katyusha rocket launchers.
Stalin's organs.
That's what the Germans called them, because of the sound and the sheer volume of rockets they fired. At the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Soviets reportedly employed over 20,000 artillery pieces and fired 500,000 shells in a single day during the opening bombardment, just pulverizing enemy positions.
What about the Americans?
The Americans focused more on mobile firepower and precision. They developed self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest, basically an artillery piece on a tank chassis so it could keep up with advancing armor. They also developed the tank destroyer concept vehicles like the M10 Wolverine, designed specifically to hunt tanks, but often capable of providing artillery support too.
And time on target.
TOT, a really sophisticated American technique. It involved coordinating fire from multiple dispersed artillery batteries, sometimes miles apart, calculating different flight times so that all their shells arrived on the target
Really
simultaneously.
effective.
Devastating. No warning for the enemy, no time to dive for cover, just a sudden, massive concentration of explosions. It was incredibly effective against enemy batteries, troop concentrations, fortifications, used to great effect in places like the Battle of the Bulge in Okinawa.
And the proximity fuse, you mentioned that briefly.
Ah, yes, the proximity fuse, a pivotal yet often underappreciated technological leap, developed mainly by the US and Britain. Instead of needing a direct hit or a timer, the fuse used a small radar device to detonate the shell when it got close to a target. An aircraft, troops in the open, etc.
Making near misses count.
Exactly. It dramatically increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire, especially against V-1s later in the war. And for ground artillery, it was devastating against infantry caught in the open or in trenches, causing airbursts above them, a real force multiplier.
One last area of innovation, airborne operations. Paratroopers.
Right. This seemed like a revolutionary concept, dropping soldiers behind enemy lines to seize key objectives, bridges, airfields. The Germans had some stunning early successes.
Ibenimo.
Crete. Exactly. The capture of the supposedly impregnable Belgian fortress of Eben Emael in 1940 by glider troops was audacious. The invasion of Crete in 1941, using mostly paratroopers, was the first operation of its kind. It succeeded, but the German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, suffered horrific casualties.
Which made Hitler hesitant.
Yes. The losses on Crete were so high that Hitler apparently deemed large-scale airborne operations too risky afterwards. He largely restricted his elite paratroopers to ground roles for much of the rest of the war.
But the Allies embraced airborne forces.
They did. Airborne operations became a cornerstone of strategy for the Allies, especially the Americans and British. The Normandy D-Day landings are the prime example. Thousands of paratroopers dropped behind the beaches in the early hours to seize bridges, disrupt communications, sow confusion.
Vital for the invasion's success.
Arguably vital. But later operations showed the limitations. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the attempt to seize bridges in the Netherlands to open a route into Germany, was famously a bridge too far.
What went wrong?
A combination of factors. Intelligence failures about German strength, poor weather hindering reinforcements, the paratroopers being dropped too far from their objectives, and crucially, the ground forces being unable to link up with them quickly enough. It highlighted the immense risks and logistical challenges. Airborne forces were incredibly brave, but vulnerable if isolated or if the ground advance stalled. They needed that rapid link-up.
Okay, let's shift gears now. We want to focus on a nation whose role in World War II is often, well, barely mentioned in many popular histories, especially in the West, but was actually crucial. Brazil.
Yes, Brazil's story is fascinating and really important for understanding the Allied effort, particularly in the Atlantic.
Where did Brazil stand at the start of the war?
Initially, Brazil maintained neutrality. This was under President Getulio Vargas. He was leading the country under what he called the Estado Novo, the new state, established in 1937. It was an authoritarian regime, nationalist, even drew some inspiration from European fascist movements in its structure and rhetoric. So Vargas tried to play both sides initially, balancing relationships with Germany and Italy, where Brazil had large immigrant communities, and the Allies, especially the US, its dominant trading partner.
What changed that? What pushed Brazil off the fence?
It came down to direct attacks. German U-boats began targeting Brazilian merchant ships in the Atlantic in early 1942. These weren't accidents. It seems to have been a deliberate escalation by Germany, perhaps to intimidate Brazil or disrupt potential Allied supply lines.
Can you give some examples?
The real turning point was August 1942. Within just a few days, several Brazilian ships were torpedoed without warning off the Brazilian coast. The SS Beypendi, carrying civilian passengers and some soldiers, sank on August 15th with 270 lives lost. Then came the Araraquara, the Anibal Benevolo, the Itagaba, all sunk in quick succession.
That must have caused outrage.
Immense outrage. Public opinion, which had been divided, swung decisively against the Axis. There were massive demonstrations in cities like Rio de Janeiro demanding action. Our sources also list other sinkings around this time: Vital do Oliveira, Camaquã, Bahia, Cabedelo, Borque, Itapé, Siqueira Campos. It became impossible for Vargas to maintain neutrality. The attacks forced his hand.
So Brazil declared war.
Yes, in August 1942, Brazil formally declared war on Germany and Italy. This marked a huge shift, transforming Brazil from a neutral observer into an active, committed participant on the Allied side.
And its location immediately made it strategically vital, right? That bulge into the Atlantic.
Absolutely critical. Brazil's geography, that long coastline over 7,000 kilometers, and the easternmost point of the Americas jutting out towards Africa, made it a linchpin for the Allies in the Battle of the South Atlantic.
For supply lines and anti-submarine warfare.
Both. It was vital for the Atlantic lifeline, particularly for ferrying aircraft from the U.S. to the war zones in North Africa and beyond. Flying across the narrowest part of the South Atlantic from Brazil to West Africa was much safer and quicker than the dangerous North Atlantic route, which was heavily infested with U-boats.
So the U.S. invested heavily there.
Yes, recognizing the strategic value, the U.S. poured resources into developing Brazilian infrastructure, especially airfields and naval bases in the Northeast. This transformed the region into a vital logistical node.
Natal is the famous one.
Natal in Rio Grande do Norte became known as the Brazilian Gateway. Its airfield, Parnamirim Field, rapidly grew into one of the busiest airfields in the world during the war. Thousands of U.S. aircraft bombers, fighters, transports transited through Natal on their way to the fight in Africa and Europe. It was a crucial bottleneck, a symbol of the U.S.-Brazil partnership.
Were other cities involved too?
Oh, yes. Recife in Pernambuco and Salvador in Bahia also became major military hubs. The U.S. Navy worked closely with Brazil to upgrade port facilities, build warehouses, hospitals, fuel depots. These bases were essential for supporting Allied naval operations, repairing ships, and providing rest and resupply for sailors fighting the U-boat menace.
Did Brazil actively participate in fighting U-boats?
It did. This joint effort wasn't just about bases. Brazil contributed significantly to securing the South Atlantic. Although its own Navy and Air Force were relatively small and modestly equipped at the start, they were rapidly expanded and modernized with U.S. help patrol aircraft, destroyers, etc. Brazilian forces actively hunted U-boats, escorted convoys along their coast, and worked closely with U.S. forces.
Was this effective?
Very much so. Their combined efforts significantly reduced the U-boat threat in the South Atlantic, ensuring that vital shipping lanes remained open for the flow of troops and supplies. It was a crucial, if often unsung, contribution to the overall Allied victory.
Now, the most visible part of Brazil's contribution was probably the soldiers they sent overseas. The
The Força Expedicionária Brasileira, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, or FEB. Yes, this was a truly monumental undertaking for Brazil at the time. They mobilized and trained an infantry division of about 25,000 soldiers specifically for combat in Europe.
How was it structured and equipped?
It was organized along the lines of a standard U.S. Army infantry division with 3 infantry regiments, the 1st, 6th, and 11th, plus artillery, engineers, and support units. It was almost entirely equipped with American weapons and gear, M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, M4 Sherman tanks, artillery pieces. This ensured they could integrate seamlessly with Allied forces.
And they had that famous motto.
A cobra está fumando, literally, the snake is smoking. It apparently originated from skepticism back home that Brazil would actually send troops to fight. People said it was more likely for a snake to start smoking a pipe. So when the FEB actually deployed, they adopted the smoking snake as their divisional patch, a symbol of defiance and proving the doubters wrong.
Where did they fight?
They were assigned to the U.S. Fifth Army in the grueling Italian campaign. They arrived in Italy in mid-1944 and were thrown into some very tough fighting in the Apennine Mountains.
What were the conditions like?
Extremely difficult. Our sources talk about formidable terrain, rugged mountains, narrow valleys, perfect for defense. They faced determined German resistance from experienced mountain troops, and they had to deal with harsh winter weather, snow, freezing cold, mud, plus the constant logistical challenges of fighting in the mountains. It was a brutal campaign for everyone involved.
Did the FEB distinguish itself?
It certainly did. Their most famous action was the Battle of Monte Castello. This was a key German defensive position in the northern Apennines. After several costly attempts by other Allied units had failed, the Brazilians, after intense and grueling combat in February 1945, finally captured the mountain.
A major victory for them.
A huge morale booster and a demonstration of their resilience and fighting ability. It proved they could overcome determined resistance in incredibly tough conditions. It became a symbol of Brazilian military prowess.
Did they participate in the final offensive?
Yes. The FEB took part in Operation Grapeshot, the final Allied offensive in Italy in the spring of 1945. They helped break through the German lines, advanced rapidly across the Po Valley, and even took the surrender of a German division. They played their part right up to the end of the war in Italy.
But it came at a cost.
It did. Around 450 Brazilian soldiers lost their lives fighting in Italy, a significant sacrifice for a nation that had initially been neutral. Their contribution is commemorated in Italy and Brazil to this day.
What was the broader impact of the war back in Brazil itself?
It had profound effects. Economically, the war significantly accelerated Brazil's industrialization and modernization. The need to supply raw materials to the Allies, plus U.S. investment, spurred growth. A key example is the Volta Redonda steel plant, built with substantial U.S. financial and technical assistance during the war. It became the cornerstone of Brazil's heavy industry and laid the foundation for its post-war economic rise.
And politically, socially.
Sociopolitically, participating in the war effort fostered a much stronger sense of national pride and unity, bringing together people from different regions and backgrounds for a common cause. But it also created a paradox.
How so?
Brazil was sending its soldiers to fight against fascist dictatorships in Europe, while still being run by an authoritarian regime, the Estado Novo, at home. This contradiction became increasingly apparent and fueled demands for democratization. The experience of the soldiers returning from fighting for democracy abroad contributed significantly to the pressure that eventually led to Vargas being peacefully overthrown in October 1945 and Brazil transitioning back to democracy.
Interesting. And internationally?
Brazil's contributions definitely enhanced its international standing, particularly within the Western Hemisphere. It solidified its relationship with the United States and boosted its diplomatic prestige. Brazil earned a seat at the table in post-war planning discussions, including the San Francisco Conference that established the United Nations. It emerged from the war as a more confident and influential regional power.
One last point on Brazil. Did the Axis try to influence things there before the war declaration, given the large German and Italian communities?
Oh, absolutely. Our sources mention significant Axis efforts, especially by Germany, to exert influence in Brazil before and during the early stages of the war. They used propaganda, cultural outreach, espionage, and tried to cultivate pro-Axis sentiment among the German and Italian diaspora communities, hoping to destabilize the government or at least keep Brazil neutral and weaken its ties to the U.S.
But it didn't work.
Ultimately, no. While there was some pro-Axis sympathy, especially within parts of the military and elite, the U-boat attacks solidified public opinion against them. Vargas, despite his regime's initial leanings, ultimately sided with the Allies out of strategic necessity and popular pressure. The Axis influence campaign failed to achieve its main goals, demonstrating the strength of Brazilian national identity and pragmatism.
As we look back at this colossal conflict, we absolutely have to confront the human cost. It was just staggering. And the way civilians were impacted, it was different.
Profoundly different. World War II saw the civilianization of warfare reach truly unprecedented levels. The old, somewhat shaky distinction between combatants on the front line and non-combatants back home basically collapsed. Civilians became direct targets on a massive scale.
The death toll numbers are almost impossible to comprehend.
Estimates vary, but typically range from 70 to 85 million people killed worldwide. That makes it, by a huge margin, the deadliest conflict in all of human history. And the majority of those deaths were civilians. This marks a terrifying erosion of civilian immunity.
Where was this felt most acutely?
The Eastern Front was horrific. Millions upon millions of Soviet civilians died due to deliberate German occupation policies, mass executions, starvation, forced labor. Some estimates suggest 7 million Soviet civilians died in the first 2 years of the occupation alone. The total Soviet death toll, military and civilian, is estimated at a staggering 27 million.
And events like the Siege of Leningrad.
A prime example of civilian suffering. The city was besieged by the Germans for nearly 900 days. Over 1 million civilians died, mostly from starvation, cold, and disease. Just unimaginable horror.
What about in Asia?
Equally devastating. Estimates suggest anywhere from 4 to 10 million civilians died across Southeast Asia due to Japanese occupation policies, brutality, forced labor, and induced famines. Think of the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, where thousands of Filipino-American prisoners were marched to death. Or the Romusha, the forced laborers conscripted in places like Java, hundreds of thousands of whom perished.
And China had been fighting Japan for years already.
Since 1937, China's losses were immense, estimated between 15 and 20 million dead, the vast majority civilians, due to massacres, bombing, starvation, and disease resulting from the conflict.
And we already mentioned the strategic bombing campaigns.
Yes, the firebombing of cities like Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo. These raids deliberately targeted urban centers, aiming to destroy industry and morale, but inevitably killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Operation Meeting House in Tokyo alone, as we said, killed perhaps 100,000 in one night.
And then the Holocaust.
The absolute nadir. The systematic, state-sponsored, industrialized extermination of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. Along with millions of others, Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled people, political opponents, homosexuals. Our sources rightly call it a deliberate and industrialized effort to annihilate entire populations. It wasn't just a consequence of war, it was a central ideological goal of the Nazi state, carried out with chilling bureaucratic efficiency in camps built specifically for mass murder.
The war also forced some terrible moral dilemmas, didn't it? Especially with new technologies.
Absolutely. The most prominent example is the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. These two bombs instantly killed somewhere around 200,000 people, mostly civilians, and unleashed the terrifying power of nuclear weapons on the world.
How was it justified at the time?
Allied leaders, primarily President Truman, justified it as the necessary means to force Japan's surrender without resorting to a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall. Military planners projected horrific casualties for such an invasion, potentially up to 1 million American casualties, and maybe 10 million Japanese deaths, given the expected fierce resistance.
So the argument was it saved lives in the long run.
That was the argument. Whether it was truly necessary or if other options like continued conventional bombing and blockade or Soviet entry into the war would have forced surrender soon anyway is still fiercely debated by historians. But there's no question it marked a terrifying turning point in the history of warfare and starkly highlighted the moral ambiguities of total war. It ushered in the nuclear age and its existential threat.
Our sources also talk about a collapse of parity. What does that mean?
It refers to the idea that historically, there was often a rough balance or parity between the power of offensive weapons and defensive capabilities. World War II, with its rapid technological advancements, tanks, aircraft, submarines, radar, rocketry, and ultimately the atomic bomb shattered that balance. Offense gained a massive advantage, leading to unprecedented lethality and, as we've discussed, the blurring of lines between soldiers and civilians. Entire societies became part of the war machine and thus potential targets.
Amidst all this horror and technology, what about the experience of the ordinary soldier?
Despite all the technology, the ground forces, the infantry, the tankers, the artillerymen remained the absolute linchpin of victory and defeat. They were the ones who had to take and hold ground, enduring unimaginable hardships.
The conditions must have been appalling.
Whether it was the brutal, freezing cold of the Russian winter, the suffocating jungle heat and diseases of the Pacific Islands, or the grueling mountain combat in Italy. These soldiers faced extreme physical challenges, constant fear, and the psychological trauma of intense, prolonged combat. Millions suffered and died in these conditions.
Yet one source notes something interesting about Allied casualties compared to World War I.
Yes, it's a striking point. While overall casualties were vastly higher in WWII, the percentage of military casualties relative to the total number of forces mobilized was, for some Allied nations like the U.S. and Britain, remarkably lower than in World War I.
Why was that?
A combination of factors. Better medical care, including things like penicillin and blood plasma, much closer to the front lines, faster evacuation systems, and arguably strategic and technological innovations that allowed them sometimes to substitute firepower or air power for manpower, aiming to achieve objectives with fewer ground troops exposed, though this often came at a higher cost to enemy soldiers and civilians. It reflects a conscious effort, learning from the slaughter of WWI, to try and wage war more efficiently in terms of their own casualties, if such a term can even be used in this context.
Leadership obviously played a huge role in navigating this immense conflict. How did the key leaders shape events?
Their decisions, their personalities, their strategic vision, or lack thereof, were absolutely critical. Let's start with Churchill again.
His defiance in 1940.
That strategic foresight and moral conviction was crucial, as we discussed. It kept Britain in the fight. Our sources also note his relationship with his military chiefs, like General Alan Brooke. While sometimes interfering, he generally understood the need for careful planning and avoiding overextension, learning lessons from disastrous campaigns like Gallipoli and WWI. He also backed commanders like Montgomery, who were meticulous planners, even if sometimes slow.
What about Roosevelt, FDR?
Roosevelt's strategic vision was perhaps broader, more long-term. His commitment to defeating Nazi Germany was clear even before Pearl Harbor, pushing through Lend-Lease against significant opposition. He understood the importance of sea power, championing the massive expansion of the U.S. Navy for a two-ocean war.
And he had to balance Allied demands.
Constantly. The sources mention his reluctant acceptance of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in 1942. He initially preferred an earlier landing in France, Operation Sledgehammer, to take pressure off the Soviets, but was persuaded by Churchill and the British military that it was too risky at that stage. It shows the compromises inherent in coalition warfare and his flexibility.
Stalin's leadership seems more complex. Blunders and pragmatism.
Very much so. His initial misjudgment of Hitler leading up to Barbarossa was catastrophic, leading to those enormous early Soviet losses. He purged many of his best military commanders in the late 1930s, which also severely weakened the Red Army initially.
Yet he recovered.
He showed remarkable, if ruthless, pragmatism and adaptability. He forged that alliance with the capitalist West, swallowing his ideological pride out of sheer necessity. And he proved brutally effective at mobilizing the entire Soviet state and population for the war effort, demanding immense sacrifices but ultimately achieving victory on the Eastern Front through sheer resilience and overwhelming numbers, backed by that relocated industry.
How do the Axis leaders compare? Our sources seem quite critical.
Generally, yes. Their leadership is often characterized by fatal flaws. Hitler's increasing micromanagement, especially on the Eastern Front, often overruled his generals' military judgment, leading to disasters like the Stand-Fast Order at Stalingrad. His racial ideology also led to incredibly brutal occupation policies that alienated potential allies and fueled massive resistance movements.
Mussolini, Kojo.
Mussolini's leadership is described as full of ambition and overreach. His invasion of Greece in 1940 was a military disaster that required German intervention, diverting crucial resources. Tojo and the Japanese military leadership made the strategic blunder of attacking Pearl Harbor, which guaranteed the U.S. would enter the war with its full industrial might, focused on Japan's defeat. For all Axis leaders, ideological obsessions often seem to trump sound military strategy, leading to overextension, misallocation of resources, and ultimately defeat.
This brings us to coalition warfare itself. The Allies were such an odd mix.
An unlikely amalgamation, as one source puts it. The United States, a liberal democracy. The Soviet Union, a totalitarian communist state. The British Empire, a vast colonial power with its own interests. They had very different long-term goals and deep mutual suspicions.
But they held it together.
They did remarkably well under the circumstances. Their shared overriding objective, the unconditional defeat of the Axis powers, trumped everything else, despite the fissures, and there were many.
Like Stalin demanding a second front.
Constantly. He put immense pressure on Roosevelt and Churchill to open a major front in Western Europe much earlier than 1944 to relieve the Red Army. There were also disagreements over strategy in the Pacific, resource allocation, but overall, the Allies showed remarkable adaptability.
How do they manage it?
Through constant communication, high-level conferences like Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, through establishing combined command structures like Eisenhower's SHAEF in Europe, through mechanisms like Lend-Lease for sharing resources, and crucially, through a shared pragmatism.
Prioritizing military goals over ideology.
Largely, yes. Unlike the Axis, the Allies often subordinated political or ideological differences to the immediate needs of winning the war. The US and UK sent vast amounts of aid to the Communist Soviet Union. They relied heavily on troops from across the British Empire, despite the growing calls for independence. This focus on operational success allowed them to coordinate effectively and wage total war.
Let's look at some of the key campaigns that brought about victory, driven by this coalition. The Italian campaign.
Often called the soft underbelly of Europe, though it proved anything but soft. It began with Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The success led directly to Mussolini being overthrown and Italy switching sides, although Germany quickly occupied most of the country.
It was a long, hard fight up the peninsula.
A grueling and costly endeavor, yes. The mountainous terrain heavily favored the defenders, and the Germans fought tenaciously. But the Italian campaign served a crucial strategic purpose. It tied down significant numbers of high-quality German divisions, maybe 24 at its peak, preventing them from being used on the Eastern Front or against the upcoming invasion of France. It was a vital contribution, even if slow and bloody.
And then the big one, D-Day, Normandy.
June 6, 1944. Operation Overlords, truly the largest amphibious invasion in history. Its success was built on years of planning, massive logistical preparation, and crucially, Allied dominance of the sea and air.
Air superiority was key.
Absolutely essential. Allied control of the skies over the English Channel and Normandy meant the German Luftwaffe couldn't effectively attack the invasion fleet or the beachheads, and German ground forces couldn't move easily during daylight without being attacked from the air. The element of surprise regarding the landing location was also critical. D-Day unequivocally marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany by opening that long-awaited major second front in Western Europe.
What about the Pacific, the strategy there?
The island-hopping strategy, primarily driven by the U.S. Navy and Marines under Admirals Nimitz and Halsey and General MacArthur. The idea wasn't to conquer every single Japanese-held island that would have been too slow and costly.
So they bypassed some.
Exactly. They focused on selectively targeting and capturing strategically important islands, ones that had good airfields or anchorages, while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds. Think of places like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each step brought them closer to Japan, established forward bases, conserved resources, and maintained momentum.
And capturing the Marianas was key for the B-29s.
Yes, capturing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands in mid-1944 was a major strategic victory because it finally put the Japanese home islands within range of the B-29 superfortresses based there. That enabled the strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself to begin in earnest.
So by early 1945, the end is in sight for Germany.
Definitely. The Allies were pushing deep into Germany from the west, having crossed the Rhine, while the Soviet Red Army was closing in relentlessly from the east, fighting brutal battles on the approaches to Berlin. The German military machine was crippled by shortages, manpower, fuel, ammunition, everything. They were being crushed between two massive fronts. Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge Offensive in December 1944, failed, and only hastened the end by using up Germany's last reserves.
And Japan's surrender, what finally forced it?
It was really a two-pronged strategy, as our sources describe it. Prong one was the relentless conventional pressure, the naval blockade strangling imports, the devastating conventional bombing of Japanese cities, and the steady advance across the Pacific, culminating in the incredibly bloody battle for Okinawa, which showed how fanatically the Japanese might defend their home islands.
And prong two?
The atomic bombs, dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. This introduced a terrifying new factor. Around the same time, the Soviet Union also declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, quickly defeating Japanese forces there. Faced with this hopeless situation, utter devastation from the air, blockade, Soviet invasion, and the threat of more atomic bombs, Emperor Hirohito intervened.
Citing the bomb.
In his radio broadcast announcing the surrender, he famously cited the new and most cruel bomb as a primary reason for ending the war to prevent further suffering. Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, finally bringing World War II to an end.
So the war is over, but the world has completely changed. Let's talk about the legacies, the consequences. Victory, yes, but at what cost?
An almost unimaginable cost. The human and physical devastation was, as we've said, staggering. 85 million dead. Cities across Europe and Asia reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, economies shattered, entire societies traumatized by violence, loss, and displacement on a scale never seen before.
And the Holocaust's shadow.
A permanent scar on human conscience. Plus, the dawn of the nuclear age cast a terrifying shadow over the future. The sheer scale of the destruction forced a global reckoning.
Germany itself was physically divided.
Yes. After the surrender, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided. This temporary arrangement solidified as Cold War tensions rose, leading to the creation of 2 separate German states: West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, German Democratic Republic. Germany became a microcosm of the broader Cold War, a literal dividing line between East and West that would last for over 40 years.
Japan's transformation was also profound.
Under American occupation, led by General MacArthur, Japan underwent fundamental changes. A new democratic constitution was imposed, renouncing war. The emperor's role was redefined. Significant land reforms broke up large estates and empowered tenant farmers. And with U.S. aid and guidance, Japan began the economic recovery that would eventually turn it into a global economic giant. a remarkable turnaround from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy.
Italy also saw major changes.
Italy experienced its own economic miracle in the post-war decades, particularly the 1950s and 60s. Fueled by Marshall Plan aid from the U.S., a shift towards export-oriented industries and internal migration, Italy saw rapid industrialization and urbanization, transforming from a largely agricultural society into a modern industrial nation.
Beyond individual nations, the war created a whole new global order.
Absolutely. The most immediate and obvious consequence was the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The traditional great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany were exhausted or defeated. The US and USSR emerged with unmatched military and economic might, but with diametrically opposed ideologies.
Setting the stage for the Cold War.
Precisely. Their ideological divide, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism, quickly turned them from wartime allies into global rivals. This bipolar confrontation shaped international relations for the next 45 years, leading to proxy wars, an arms race, and constant geopolitical tension.
The war also fueled decolonization.
Significantly, the war fatally weakened the European colonial powers. Japan's early victories shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia. Britain and France emerged victorious but economically drained and militarily diminished. Nationalist movements in colonies across Asia and Africa, often strengthened by wartime experiences and promises, intensified their demands for independence.
Like India.
India gaining independence in 1947 was a watershed moment, triggering a wave of decolonization across the globe over the next 2 decades. The old colonial empires crumbled.
But the war also led to attempts at international cooperation.
Yes, the horrors of the war created a strong desire to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. This led to the establishment of new international institutions. The most important was the United Nations, founded in 1945, intended as a forum for resolving disputes peacefully and promoting collective security.
And economic institutions.
The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, aiming to create a stable global economic order and facilitate post-war reconstruction, avoiding the economic nationalism that had contributed to the war. So there was a real push for global governance.
And alliances shifted dramatically.
Completely reconfigured. The Cold War created new alignments. Former enemies West Germany and Japan became crucial strategic allies of the United States and the West in the effort to contain Soviet communism. It was a stunning geopolitical reversal driven by the new realities of the bipolar world.
Finally, the sources mention the pursuit of perpetual peace. Was that achieved?
That was certainly a stated goal of the Allies, echoing ideals from World War I. But the reality of the post-war world was far from perpetual peace. The Cold War brought its own tensions and numerous bloody conflicts. Regional wars, civil wars, insurgencies continued across the globe. It raises profound questions about the complexities of human conflict and whether even a decisive victory over manifest evil can guarantee lasting global tranquility. Perhaps the seeds of future conflicts are often sown in the very outcomes of past ones.
So looking back at everything we've discussed, World War II was just this incredible complex storm, a clash of powerful ideologies on a global stage, stunning technological leaps changing warfare forever, immense industrial power deciding fates.
The sheer resilience of the human spirit enduring unimaginable hardship, and those critical, pivotal decisions by leaders steering nations through the chaos.
And as we saw, even elements we don't always focus on, like Brazil's crucial role in the Atlantic and Italy, played a really significant part in how it all unfolded.
Absolutely. The lessons from this period, they still echo so strongly today, don't they? The vital need for adaptation when things change rapidly, the terrible cost of unchecked aggression, the deep moral questions that arise in total war.
And the surprising power of global cooperation, even between unlikely partners, to genuinely alter the course of history.
It really makes you think.
And so, for you, our listener, here's something to consider as we wrap up. We've seen how WWII utterly transformed military technology, the relationship between offense and defense, and the whole structure of international alliances. What does the legacy of wartime innovation, that constantly shifting balance of power, and the formation of those unexpected partnerships, what does it tell us about conflict and cooperation in our world today? A world where technology often seems to advance faster than our wisdom to manage it, and where global challenges seem to demand collaboration across old divides more than ever before.
A powerful question to leave with.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into World War II. We hope it's given you a clearer, perhaps a more nuanced understanding of this incredibly pivotal and complex period in human history.